and welcome to a Climate Conversation podcast. We're thrilled that you're joining us. This podcast is a complement to the documentary A Climate Conversation, which is really the vision of Walt Johnson. Walt Johnson, welcome to this podcast. These are really rich discussions that we're having, and I know you're extremely excited about the guest that we have today, Walt.
Thank you very much.
And our guest is John Harpole, and he is the president and founder of Mercator Energy. And Dave O'Rourke, our spokesperson for A Climate Conversation. Where should we start?
Well, first of all, I'll start the way I typically end these things with gratitude to be part of this process, and sincere thanks to Walt for vision and energy and commitment that went into creating A Climate Conversation, and to John Harpole, who I think is about to participate in one of our most fascinating podcasts. We're going to hear from someone who is not on the sidelines having opinions. He's in the business of keeping us warm, or keeping us cool, or keeping the machine of our industry running. At Mercator Energy, they handle, I believe, John, it's something like 1.5% of the natural gas that's consumed in the United States every year. I think you might be the largest broker of natural gas in the United States. And you know more about the sourcing, production, generation, storage, transportation, distribution, and debits and credits, and more of the players possibly than anybody in the world when it comes to natural gas, at least in the United States, we can say that. So glad we get to spend some time and hear from somebody who not only has skin in the game, but, is living in the game of actually producing the energy that's required for us to enjoy this American lifestyle.
Dave, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to force my 3 kids to listen to it so that you can better appreciate what God knows. You're too kind. And that word gratitude, I know we're all very, very anxious about what's going on in the world these days. And I heard something from a psychologist the other day, not one that I visit with on a regular basis, but the psychologist said you can't feel the emotions of gratitude and anxiety at the same time. And so maybe that's a takeaway for us here today, is to be grateful for the vision that Walter's had and for your effort to kind of get the word out to those that may not be as intellectually curious as they should be.
Well, we have a wonderful topic today, which will generally be related to food security, which, as our recent guest Trent Lucis said, food security is national security, and I don't know how anybody could argue with that. But in this idea of getting the word out, we had news very recently from the Supreme Court, and I know that you probably have more information and understanding of what it all means than, almost anyone else. Can you give us a little background on what's happening?
So this is a case that again, there have been a lot of decisions by the Supreme Court over the last 40 years, but I think this is in the top 3. It's called the Chevron deference. In 1984, in a case years ago that kind of set the tone for all the agencies, the U.S. agencies. If an agency interpreted the existing law in the country a certain way, because that law may not be black and white, the Supreme Court at the time in 1984 gave them the deference to do that. Well, that's been removed as of this morning. And I can't tell you, in my career, I graduated from the University of Colorado in 1981. This is the biggest decision that I think will impact the abuse that I think agencies have exercised over the last 40 years. Really, it's 50 years. It's stunning. And we had hoped that would be their decision. I think ultimately it was a 6-3 decision. I'm not sure, but the reverberations of this will be felt for some time. So that plainly stated, an administration like the Biden administration cannot go appoint a new head to the EPA and then just unilaterally make laws or make regulations that quote unquote interpret laws that are not voted on by Congress. So it's going to bring back the balance, I believe, between the three different bodies in the United States, the executive wing, the House, the Senate, and it's magnificent. It's just terrific news for all of us that are conservative.
John,
There-
what do you think this decision means for just everyday people, just living their lives? How would you interpret that for everyday people?
So let's look at it here in Colorado. So if we're in an ozone non-attainment area from Denver to nearly to the edge of Fort Collins or northern Fort Collins, the EPA can come in and mandate certain restrictions and certain performance standards that we have to abide by through their interpretation of the ozone non-attainment standards that fall under their purview. This can get really complicated, Kim, but our own governor deferred rather than protest. He deferred to the EPA to mandate certain performance standards under the ozone non-attainment standard here for Colorado, which means it affects oil and gas drilling. It affects driving in the state. It affects water usage, you name it. It affects electric generation, that sort of thing. All of those, none of those that have been debated, I think, thoroughly by the people of the country and then discussed with our congressional representatives. So I believe these agencies, through the Chevron deference decision in 1984, have usurped authority from the Congress. And it's not what our forefathers planned in terms of representative government. It's been chaos, I think, honestly, Kim. And I just think day to day we're going to see this play out where some prior decisions, now it doesn't overturn all the agencies' decisions in prior times, but they can now be questioned legally, and it's a huge thing. We'll see it play out
Great.
in our day-to-day lives.
Great.
Technically, the EPA could restrict how much driving we could do in this ozone non-attainment area. They could come up with whatever plan that they wanted to get us to abide by their standards, and that's just not the American way.
We had Greg Walcher on recently, who I believe he has a wonderful perspective on these things. And the broader context was the taking was eminent domain, and he's particularly interested in, for example, the Endangered Species Act. It's many species go on, no species come off. It's
right,
like the Roach Motel in reverse or whatever. But anyway, we also had another Supreme Court ruling that overturned the 9th District's decision about homeless people in California, where I live. And it's no longer mandates cities. In other words, effectively, it allows cities to deal with the homeless problem in effective ways. They're not hamstrung the way they were. It's just, I think all these things fit in the category of freedom.
Well, it's freedom, Dave. I think it's also human flourishing. Are we about the earth flourishing or about human flourishing on the earth? And that, for me, is kind of the central theme that runs through probably every discussion that we're going to have today, is that human flourishing has been forgotten by so many. And I don't think they fully appreciate the impact of some of these decisions by agencies that were just unilateral decisions made by figureheads and not by the people.
Well, it's such a big topic. Just the other day, my wife is a community planning consultant. She had a very, very great career here in Northern California, helping cities, particularly update their general plans and work their way through things like their greenhouse gas emission mandates that the state of California puts down on them. So this is a conversation in our house from time to time. And she referred the other day to constraints in one of her municipal clients as the law about homeless people. And I was like, this isn't the law.
No.
This was an adjudicated thing that came down from a single justice probably 5 years ago, and I don't know how many, but a while back. And we have to calculate in hundreds of thousands how many people have died as a result of that law. The costs of these things to humanity are enormous. But things like the homeless legislation are nothing compared to a ban on fertilizer, for example, which I know is something that's a great, very real concern to you as a man, as a person, not just as a natural gas broker.
Well,
So that's one of the topics that we're most keenly interested in hearing from you on.
let me wind into a little story to kind of introduce the fertilizer idea, if I can. I'm a 44-year veteran of the oil and gas industry. I'm a third generation native to East Denver. Was born and raised here. I grew up with 8 brothers and sisters. I was the 8th kid out of 9. Being the 8th child out of 9, I think I'm really good at threat assessment, because every morning I'd wake up and try to determine which older sibling I had to watch out for. So, but putting that aside, I started to work out of college for an oil and gas company that was owned by General Electric. And when natural gas transportation was deregulated, I was put in charge of something I had no idea how it functioned, but I put in charge with 2 others on how to supply natural gas to about 60 GE industrial facilities across the United States, behind 34 different utilities. And you've got to appreciate this is long before there were GPS and certainly cell phones. So I'd fly into a city, typically have the plant manager of GE Major Appliance in Louisville, Kentucky, pick me up at the airport, take me to a hotel, and the next morning I'd get a tour of a facility that still boggles my mind. GE Major Appliance had 40 acres under one roof. And so, mind you, I came from the sister company to GE Major Appliance, Ladd Petroleum, that was an oil and gas producer. And Jack Welch at that time wanted us to actually take our natural gas directly to these GE facilities under the new world of deregulated natural gas pipeline transportation. And so for about 4.5, 5 years, I flew about 150,000 miles a year, showing these GE facilities how to buy gas directly from their producer, oil and gas producer sister company. Flash forward, they were acquired, Ladd was acquired. They wanted me to move to Houston. I didn't want to leave my native Denver, and so I started my own company. And ostensibly, we are brokers, as you said, in natural gas, or we show industrial facilities how to buy gas, and we show oil and gas producers how to sell gas. And we never really mix the two, because you can't maximize your benefit to a producer by, simultaneously selling to an end user that you're supposed to be saving for. So, but as you mentioned, we handle about 1% of the total flow of natural gas in the U.S. with 4 individuals and myself. So we see a lot. And in those 44 years, there's not much that I haven't participated in the flow of natural gas from the wellhead to the burner tip. So imagine in 2003, before what we all know as the shale revolution, I looked at it and I said, look, we're going to have to import natural gas. And in 2003, we thought that by now, 2024, 2025, we would be importing 25 to 40% of our natural gas from overseas, because we hadn't discovered this great combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. The shale revolution hadn't happened yet. So imagine that in 2003, Gazprom, the gas producer owned by the Kremlin, ostensibly, the Russian gas company, was planning to hire 200 gas marketers in Houston so that they could, as they imported gas in the U.S., decide where to sell it. And then the shale revolution hit. And the shale revolution hit in a way that it nearly doubled both our natural gas production and oil production worldwide, so that we're the #1 leader in that sort of production, with no contest to other folks. And I would argue that happened because we have private property ownership of minerals, which is unique to the United States. There's not another country in the world where the property owner owns anything below the surface. That happened here in the US. But then we had these arm's length transactions between an oil and gas producer and that mineral owner to develop what's been now known as the shale revolution. And I've got a lot of slides that I know you can share with the people that watch this sort of thing, but it's stunning. But through the course of this whole thing, we've seen the effort by the NGOs to kind of try to stop what we have so successfully done here. And Dave, if you just go to slide 2, I think the number one issue out there is that people just don't understand scale. So if you read through this, it's a $90 trillion world economy. $90 trillion, and 81% of that runs on hydrocarbons. So these people that say that we can simply turn off fossil fuels have no concept of scale whatsoever. So I'll pause there and let you ask any questions you might have.
Well, Walt, I know that you are a son of the West, and I believe 5th generation Coloradan. So you walked some.
Also from East Denver.
There you go.
I was born next to DU.
So you two have a lot in common, and you've also witnessed the evolution of oil and gas exploration and development in the United States from a very, very close and personal perspective. So how crazy is the idea of an energy transition by 2050? The idea of net zero. How remote is that possibility?
That's what prompted me to do the movie. I was uncomfortable with a lot of things, the direction we were going. And I felt in order to do that, we would have a totalitarian society. And then Ken Gregory came out with the first person to estimate the cost. And this would be like 60% of our GDP from now till 2050. And we found out from our discussions later on that he was underestimating things because he did not consider the cost that would have to do to add additional electrical infrastructure, more lines to carry all this electricity, nor ways to handle all the waste. It's hazardous waste that comes out of these solar panels. So we aren't thinking enough about what we're doing.
Dave, I always say it's a huge cost with an immeasurable benefit. Imagine the state of Colorado jumping through the hoops to go to net zero by 2050, and we only contribute less than 0.2% of total CO2 worldwide. And yet, one of those solutions is to shut down, I think it was the 6th largest oil and gas producing county in the country, that also shares that benefit of agriculture in the same area. That's lived side by side with the farmers in Weld County for 100 years. It's just, again, huge cost and measurable benefit. And I don't think people fully appreciate, and I've got slides that'll kind of demonstrate that. But if you go to slide number 3, it'll show you how we measure up against the other countries of the world. We are an energy superpower now. And to think that we're going to turn this off to essentially transfer wealth from the United States to other countries is just political fantasy, a total political fantasy. But imagine what I told you before, when in 2003, we were nowhere near these numbers. And so I think that, George Mitchell, who really broke the code for the shale drilling down in the Barnett of Texas, he should be one of the greatest heroes ever recognized in the United States for what it's done for us. Imagine this, if this had not happened, what the reaction would have been, after the October 7th attacks by Hamas in Israel. Imagine how unsettled, even though the world is unsettled right now, how much more so it would be if we had to look to Russia for 30 or 40% of our natural gas supply right now. it's impossible to think about.
We don't, we actually have some clues as to what that might feel like from our friends in Germany and in other Western European countries that feel the boot on their neck from this. And the externalities reverberate around the world. It's not just Middle East, it's Ukraine.
Well, Germany was known as the industrial might of Western Europe. And so when I was doing research on that, in 2003 and 4 and 5, I was working on an import project with a Native American tribe on the west coast of the U.S. Now, the confidentiality agreement expired, but I just prefer not to name them. But they were up in Washington State, great partners. We were going to import natural gas. At that time, I started looking at who the potential suppliers were, and it was without a doubt the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas was Russia. Now, for folks that don't understand liquefied natural gas, when you freeze natural gas, you reduce its size by 300 times. So the amount of natural gas that would fit in a beach ball, if frozen, would fit in a ping pong ball. And we could put as much natural gas as 3 billion cubic feet of gas into one tanker. When you lose, what's 3 BCF mean? Well, an MCF, 1,000 cubic feet, is the amount of natural gas it would take to fill a room 10 by 10 by 10. So imagine 3 million thousand in one ship that ostensibly could heat 45,000 homes for a year. Well, we're exporting those out of the U.S. now on a regular basis, such that we're the largest exporter of LNG. So I'm looking back in 2003 and 4, and I start studying Russia and Gazprom and start to realize how unbelievably dependent Western Europe and Europe as a whole are on Russian imports. To the tune, right before they attacked Ukraine, I think Germany was 70% reliant on Russian imports. And in any war, the first thing you attack is the energy infrastructure. Well, they didn't have to do much to attack energy infrastructure when they could just withhold their gas supply to Europe. And it's really the two chancellors, the latest being, who's the one, I can't think of her name right now, who supported this German dependence on Russian imports that led them to the position now that they are deindustrialized. 2 years ago, their cost of natural gas was probably 10 to 15 times what it was here. And I've got other slides that I'll show you down the road about how many fertilizer plants closed and how many chemical plants closed and how many steel plants closed. So, and I don't mean this to be to dominate this and have it to be just a lecture, but the way Germany went is the way we could go if we let governors like Polis and the governor of California decide what our energy choices should be.
Well, we're looking for another 50-cent gas tax increase here coming up, and 50 after that and 50 after that in the subsequent years. It's already $1.21 a gallon.
I think by every economic measure, you're 50th in the U.S. in terms of economic health. You're in last place.
Yeah.
What's even more interesting is that the average income for someone in the United Kingdom is worse than every one of those average incomes for every state in the U.S. So when you think again about scale and impact, the decisions the Europeans have been making for 15, 20 years have really come back to bite them. And we should learn from those lessons. We should learn from what happened in Ukraine. We should learn from these insane decisions, the United Kingdom. And my good friend Robert Bryce said that Germany not only drove themselves into the energy ditch, but just this last spring, they closed 4 of their nuclear plants. So while the car's in the ditch, they went out and took the wheels out. Very sad.
What's the end game going to be on this, John?
I think it's an end game that has been 30 years in the making by Putin, Kim. That they're,
Wow.
If you'd watched this thing like I've been watching it really since 2002, it's frightening what he's accomplished. I mean, think about it. he made as much money, if not more, when 80% of his gas supply to Europe was cut off. The little bit that he was still selling to other countries skyrocketed so much in price that it made up for the volume that he wasn't selling. If you really want to get worried, if you really want to scare yourself, go look up Ghost Fleet for oil. And basically, it's guessed now that he has over 200 to 300 oil tankers that are not registered, that he's shipping oil to Iran and to North Korea, you name it. So he's gotten around all of the issues that Europe has thrown him to try to stop him from selling, all the sanctions that Europe has thrown at him. So look up Ghost Fleet. I'd encourage your listeners to look that up. Ghost Fleet, Russia, and oil. He has not been economically harmed by attacking Ukraine, which again is frightening. So I don't think, and I've never thought that Ukraine was his last target at all. So the end game is controlling companies through energy, to holding them hostage to his energy supply.
I'd like to add to that. I was recently on a cruise ship that was in the Bosphorus Straits, and it's unbelievable how many large tankers I saw going through with no radar and no lights on.
That's I guarantee you, Walt, those had to be some of his Ghost Fleet.
About one every hour would come
So
through.
the European Union sanctions have not worked at all. In fact, I think they've backfired. And people don't realize, again, how much wealth that country still has because of their energy. He uses energy as a tool, as a weapon, and has and will continue to do so. And that, again, Dave, that's one of my concerns, is that I think people who have less than desirable intentions about humanity will continue to attack fossil fuels to extract the outcome that they want out of the world. And my biggest worry, and if I can, I'll launch into it here. If you go to slide number 15, I'm most concerned about people not understanding how much fossil fuels contribute to food for the world. But, there are only 4 grains in the world: wheat, rice, corn, soybeans. 65% of the calories we as humans consume come from those 4 grains. And they all require intense use of nitrogen fertilizers. Now, if you go to the next slide, they're only really, the purpose of fertilizing grains is to increase their yield. Go to the next slide and I'll explain how critical nitrogen fertilizer is. So when you fertilize your own lawn, there are 3 numbers on there that all relate to the 3 different types of fertilizer. One is man-made nitrogen. 75% of the nitrogen fertilizer produced in the world comes from natural gas. Natural gas is literally the feedstock. Natural gas is synthesized to make nitrogen fertilizer. The other 2 fertilizers are mined, phosphate and potash. So imagine, like 1905, the British Academy of Sciences realized that we're running out of bird poop and bat guano from South America, and said, look, we've got to come up with some way to create man-made nitrogen fertilizer to get our yields, to keep our yields where they are. And so 2 German chemists, Haber and Bosch, came up with the way to convert coal and then later on natural gas to nitrogen-based fertilizer. And so if you go to the next slide, that process, ammonia-based fertilizers produce 40 to 60% of the food that we eat by making those nutrients more available. That single breakthrough, the Haber-Bosch process, has turned this planet from 1.6 billion people in 1900 to about 8 billion people now. And so if you go to the next slide, if we look at the growth in the population and the growth in fertilizer consumption, that's the growth in fertilizer consumption. The next slide, I believe, is just the growth in population. The key part of all of that has been nitrogen-based fertilizers. But again, now 75% of that comes from natural gas. 25% of the worldwide nitrogen comes from coal in China, because China doesn't have enough natural gas to more economically turn it into nitrogen fertilizer. But if you go to the next slide, it shows that the life expectancy during the same time period, thanks to these higher yields, there's more available food, because food poverty hasn't been the issue that it was, 100 years ago. We've seen this growth in the expectancy of life by over 40 years. Wondrous, great thing for humanity. And then the next slide is the key slide in my whole discussion today. That's really that orange box. And I saw this. This is Vaclav Smil, who, if you haven't ever heard of Vaclav Smil, I encourage you. In my notes in the back, I've referenced a couple of his books I know. But without fossil fuel-based fertilizers, agriculture can only support 3 billion of the 8 billion people on the planet. So this notion that we're going to do without fossil fuels means that 5 billion people, if we did it tomorrow, 5 billion people would starve to death in the next 3 to 5 years. 5 billion. And for me, Kim, Dave, well, this is the issue that I want to get on the table, so that if some of these folks are in favor of half the planet starving to death, I want the world to know that. This is Thomas Malthus times 10 in terms of let's do away with half the planet. And there isn't any kind of rounding error in this calculation. If you flip to slide 24, you'll see some of this battle is played out when the Dutch farmers were told that they couldn't use nitrogen fertilizer anymore on their crops. Probably one of the most prolific agricultural countries in Europe. The Dutch came out and protested in a huge way. But sadly, we have an even better, if you go to slide 27, we have a case study in terms of what happened in Sri Lanka. So their brilliant president decided that synthetic fertilizer and pesticides based on natural gas could not be used anymore, and that their 2 million farmers would have to adapt. We go to the next slide. This is what it cost Sri Lanka in terms of in less than a year. 20% decline in domestic rice production in 6 months, 50% surge in domestic rice prices, $450 million for rice imports, $425 million lost in the nation's tea crop, and then they defaulted on a $40 billion foreign debt. That's just one country that was trying to impose this, hey, we can't use any nitrogen-based fertilizer. Needless to say, that president is not in office anymore. So scale, one more slide, and then I can kind of open it up for more discussion, but to give you an idea. So Mercator Energy, one of our big clients, if you jump to the next slide, one of our big clients is probably one of the largest ammonia makers out of natural gas in the world. Dave, your house on a cold winter day in California, even in a month, might use about 4,000 cubic feet of natural gas. We have a client down in Louisiana that burns 180,000 a day to make fertilizer. Okay. A lot of these fertilizer plants are on the water so they can access all sorts of markets. But if you took every ammonia-based fertilizer plant in the world and aggregated all that demand, that'd be about 11 billion cubic feet of gas per day. That demand would rank them 10th in the world in terms of gas demand. Again, something that people aren't aware of. So one funny story. So I'm at Benedictine College. That was the school that hosted Harrison Butker at the graduation, my son's graduation about a month ago. It was such a controversial speech that he gave. And I'm talking to the dean of students at the school saying, we really need to talk to our Pope and let him know that if he endorses and supports the elimination of fossil fuels, half the planet starves to death. And I gave her this presentation. She goes, John, I'm fairly certain the Vatican isn't even aware of these issues. So when you invite him to be on this podcast, or when I'm invited to go anywhere, I'll speak up about this, because this is the issue. This is about humanity. This is about humanity. This is about half the people on the planet dying. And quite frankly, if you think about it, guess who are the first people that are going to probably starve to death?
The poor.
Asians, the poors, and Africans. So this policy of let's do away with fossil fuels could not be more racist or more anti-human than any policy I think you could doctor up since, World War II. And now I'll step off my soapbox and let some other people speak here.
So, John, this is one of the things as we have done the movie and all of these different podcasts, is there are those that are really anti-human, that it's hard to believe, but they really think there's too many people in the world.
Well, and I think that goes to my friend Patricia Limerick, who is the state historian in Colorado. She said, John, some people don't allow you to teach them. Kim, I think there's a whole middle ground of folks that are so busy living their lives that they really can't pay attention to this stuff. That if they're told that there's this elite group of people represented by a bunch of NGOs who think it's okay if half the planet starves to death, they will wake up. I think that might wake them up, Kim, sooner than realizing their electric utility bill has gone up by 50% or 100% in the last 5 years. That's my hope and prayer. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to understand and know this to get the word out. How could the Catholic Pope be supportive of eliminating fossil fuels if he knew this was the case? Couldn't. It's heretical. So
it seems there may be an epidemic that might be reversing itself of leaders who are really followers. We might have some of that right here in North America, where you really kind of have to wonder about the competence of the people that are involved. Look at the people we send to the UN, and look at the leadership sort of across the board in terms of what appears to be its lack of understanding of the externalities associated with these decisions. Is there enough copper to build the transmission environment for alternative energy transition? Is there enough rare earths? And what is the cost of extracting and developing that? Is there a methodology for the life cycle of those materials, which are in some cases phenomenally poisonous to the earth underneath them?
lithium, take lithium, for example, right?
Yes. So, have we thought this thing through? Is such a giant topic. It's kind of a little bit breathtaking when you realize there's no real scientific certainty that a warmer planet is not a beneficial thing. And that's where it all begins. We had James Camus a couple of weeks ago on here, and the subject was plate climatology. And I am not, I have a Bachelor of Science degree, but I'm no scientist. That's not what I do for a living. I'm convinced that it's subsurface geological events and phenomena that are melting the western part of Antarctica, of the ice. The eastern side is gaining in ice. The western side is losing in size. And it's obviously a function of a magma bubble. And yet no one on Earth knows that. I would say, if you want to do it out to 3 decimal points, nobody knows it.
Right.
We're told that global warming caused by people causes sea level rise because the poles are melting. And virtually not one word of that is true. And yet we're asking phenomenally expensive and impactful decisions about it.
What's the question I've got is what's happened to intellectual curiosity?
Right.
And Walt, I know I've seen on you on some of the other podcasts, this unwillingness for people to debate. The more that climate change is used as this political foil by those who won't or can't stand up to defend the intricacies of it, the less I believe it. And it's simply a tool to control.
Sorry.
Well, I think Walt needs to step away for a moment, but I was more than a little impressed by the commitment that Walt made to create this film. He had a good life. He's had a great career. He still has a great career. I think it finally dawned on him that it's going to be the actions of individuals in the aggregate that end up making a difference.
Well, I think that's the case. There are a number of different slides in here, but they really predominantly came from three different friends that I cite in the back that I hope all your listeners will follow. One of those is Doomberg, an individual that identifies himself as Doomberg, phenomenal writer. The other is, the gentleman we mentioned before, my good friend Robert Bryce, and then Roger Pilkey as well. The writings of Vaclav Smil. If you go, Dave, to slide 33, again, this goes to, I kind of started out by saying the progressives really don't understand scale. There are four pillars, fertilizer being one, cement being another, steel being another. But just take a look at these numbers. The one that blew me away here is that China produced more cement in 2020 and 2021 than we consumed in the entire 20th century here in the U.S.
Wow.
I was the benefactor of a good friend at PetroChina that invited and paid for my family to go over there twice and teach courses on natural gas to PetroChina and members of the Central Party. So my wife and kids and I got to go to China on two different occasions, once in 2009 and once in 2012. And in 2012, I was told that 25% of the natural gas consumed in China was consumed making cement and concrete. And then there's another great vignette, another story. I was meeting with a U.S.-based company that had a concession in Sichuan Basin. So this is 2012. And I said, hey, I understand, Jim, that you're going to be fracking a well down near Chengdu. He said, yes, we are. He goes, John, I have every frac truck on location, every frac truck in Asia on location to pull off that frac. Now, as you know, when you hydraulic fracture a formation, you need truck after truck after truck with water to pull off that frac. And I was fascinated by the fact that they could do one frac in China in 2012. Came home, called a friend of mine that was number two at Halliburton, and I said, Jimmy, how many different fracs can we pull off in the U.S. and Canada on a given day? And he came back to me and said 400 to 450. So when you talk about energy security, it's the infrastructure that we have that can pull off 450 times what China could at that point in time, that created us as this energy superpower, that now there's billions of dollars being spent annually to keep us from producing that fossil fuel. And again, think about it. 1.2 billion people in the world that don't have electricity, 300 million of those are in China. Think about what those other countries would get for what we have here in the U.S. But it's that model, and it's that model that I think that we should be exporting, that made the shale revolution work, in that private property ownership of minerals, so you don't have to rely on the state to have the brains to go out and do something. You rely on individuals to do those transactions with those oil and gas companies.
Hey, John, you're here in Colorado, and you've been watching the legislation. In this last legislative session in 2024, at the very last minute, there were two bills that I call them the oil and gas shakedown bills. And basically, one of them, my understanding, was new fees on the oil and gas industry, that that money will be going ostensibly to many of these NGOs that are trying to shut down the oil and gas industry. What's your thoughts about those two late-breaking bills?
Kim, if you and I could both invent the self-licking ice cream cone, we would do it, and we would write that legislation. I mean, it's just self-propagating. It's I was, Kim, I don't know if you remember, but years ago, when I was in my 30s, I was state party vice chair. And then when we had our kids, I've stepped away from that to kind of concentrate on business and raising our 3 kids. And quite frankly, I don't recognize the political landscape here anymore. So much so that here I am my grandfather was born here in lower downtown Denver in 1900. And I'd actually consider moving away, even though we've created such an amazing, wonderful life here. Because again, there's so many people that don't understand how the machine works. Now, I've been so blessed to be able, can you imagine a 27-year-old flying to 65 industrial plants across the country, seeing this manufacturing base that GE had? And you know what's fascinating? When Ronald Reagan came on as a spokesperson for GE, they had him do the same thing. And Reagan really understood the critical energy or critical infrastructure that we had created in terms of manufacturing here in the U.S. Now, a lot of those facilities have been lost to NAFTA and to maquiladoras down in Mexico. But think about that happening under a design that Putin had for Germany to eliminate the industrial might of Europe by cutting off the natural gas supply to Germany. That's in essence what the NGOs are trying to do here in Colorado, and they have the hubris to try to force us to pay their fee to put us out of business.
It's remarkable in
Machiavellian.
It is.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. You mentioned Jack Welch earlier, one of the iconic figures of the, sort of, I don't know how I describe it as a late 20th century, I suppose. Remarkable career. Whatever you think of him as a business executive, he led a phenomenally valuable franchise across 6 different industries, which to my knowledge, no one had ever done before. And you mentioned Ronald Reagan as a spokesperson for GE, and you think about how they competed. So Welch was famous for having units fire 10% of their staff every year because the idea was, we know we can do better than the bottom 10%. And of course, you sort of wonder, how many times does that have to cycle through?
So Dave, imagine visiting all those GE facilities in the time period where he was squashing mid-management. And imagine his mantra was, if you're going to compete globally, you have to source globally. And that thought process, I think we all know through COVID how critically important supply chains are. And I don't think Jack Welch in his infinite wisdom ever imagined a day when he'd have to worry about a supply chain coming from Asia.
Or let's face it, he today would have to move his headquarters to Washington, D.C. because the customer is not the customer the way it once was. Name a famous wind turbine maker, right? I'm sure there are some famous companies that make wind turbines, but they're not competing on a level playing field. Their customer is effectively the government.
They're mining tax credits, and this essentially we've devolved into not what Jack Welch knew as capitalism, but we're in this crony capitalism. So that if you can go mine your tax credit, by God, go do it. Full speed ahead. And we're spending, we've seen the Europeans do this, the United States doing $200 trillion on renewable energy that's not dispatchable. I always say to audiences, would you ever promise your daughter perfect weather on her wedding, on her outdoor wedding? Or would you ever promise your grandson that you'd go take them to fly a kite on Saturday? We're turning our grid over to resources that we cannot dispatch, we cannot turn on and off, all in the name of climate change. At the same time, these countries like China and India are building at a pace where there is absolutely no decrease in emissions. This is a great segue. If you jump to slide 43, or 42. These are from my friend Robert Bryce, and it talks about what energy transition. These are the 6 largest economies in the world. Tell me tell me that they're transitioning away from CO2 emissions. It's ridiculous. They're not. There is not an energy transition going on. That's a political fallacy. So go to the next slide.
Sorry, give me a quick second here. I got fumble fingering around. There we go.
Look at this comparison of China and India's CO2 emissions versus ours. In terms of global CO2 emissions per year, we're down from 24% as the US to 14%. But look at how 20% of that has been made up by China and India, who they're not beholden to us. They're not going to turn off. Go to the next slide. Our hydrocarbon use here has actually grown 5 to 7 times faster than these subsidized wind and solar projects. And then the next one, natural gas grew 2 times faster in 2022, the demand for it, than wind and solar. It actually went up 5.4% in 2022. Then the next slide, it's a really busy one, the next one, but you know, global spending on wind and solar totaled $4.7 trillion in those 19 years from 2004 to 23. Yet hydrocarbon during that time period increased 3.2 times faster. Then the next one, again, wind and solar as compared to global energy use. Hydrocarbons outgrew it by 51%. And then look at the next one, and this really reveals, you know, when your electric grid is not growing and when your CO2 emissions are not growing, believe me, you're not the industrial powerhouse that you once were. Look at that in terms of millions of tons.
There's an expression among poker players that I always find kind of useful, and it's coming to my mind. I'm not even sure if it's a good analogy here, but it goes like this. If you sit down at the table and you can't figure out who the mark is in the first hour, it's you. If you look at this slide, it doesn't take very long to figure out who the mark is, I don't think.
Well, remember what I said too, that the average income in the United Kingdom is less than the lowest of our 50 states. Think about what world powerhouse, what's happened to them. And I'll tell you what, it's happening to Germany right now also. You know, when that Ukraine was first invaded, actually, I think it was about 3 weeks before, there was a coal mine in Ukraine that would actually sell coal retail. And there were cars lined up in a line that took a day and a half to fill. They waited 30 hours to queue up and get enough coal to fill their trunk and then drive home for it. The bottom line is if people don't have energy security, they'll do anything they can to find it. Mm-hmm. And what this collision course that we're on right now is no fossil fuels, and I want to live the life that I grew up living. There's going to be a train wreck sometime in the next 10 years. We're going to see it happen in these events like what we saw down in Texas during Winter Storm Uri. I'm afraid we're going to see it in Colorado. There's an inevitability about it that frightens me. And I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of understand what's going to happen to get that word out as much as we can. Imagine a utility saying no to an interstate pipeline's invitation to buy more capacity on that pipeline to meet that utility's predicted needs. And imagine that utility's response is, no, we don't believe in fossil fuels anymore, so we're not going to do that. Putting all of their ratepayers, their customers at risk for a philosophy. That's happening state by state by state now. Investor-owned utility by investor-owned utility.
It's so wonderful to have an expert from the industry with such a depth of command of the economics, the supply and demand, and the real politics. Come on and talk about this. Person like me, I look at it and I wonder how long before a significant number of people channel their inner Robespierre and decide this is not good. I'm not going to chop down the trees on my property to burn wood. I'm not going to do it. We are seeing more pushback. There was just elections in the EU. There were significant messages sent from those elections in the EU and look like they'll continue to be, broadly speaking, across Europe, a move toward realism about.
That's happening. Another person listed is Michael Schellenberger.
Yes.
Michael was over there, I think, 3 or 4 months ago, after a victory on they decided not to close one nuclear facility, and he said 2 years ago, if you said we've got to do away with fossil fuels, you were the darling at the party, and now people in Germany really get it. They really understand it. I hope that in some way, shape, or form that they've learned their lesson. But you would think that that lesson would translate to, let's just pick 2 states, California and Colorado here. We're going down the same path that Helmut Kohl and the female that was, I can't even think of her name right now.
Was it Merkel?
Yes, Angela Merkel. They were buddies of Putin, and they allowed their country to become nearly solely dependent on natural gas from Putin, in a way saying that, look, if we're close to them, they'll never harm us. And yet he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was going to do. I heard that Helmut Kohl has actually been thrown out of his neighborhood association. He's so despised in Germany now.
Wow.
You look at the number of chemical plants that closed, fertilizer plants that closed, steel plants that closed, the number of those facilities that are looking to move to the United States, where we have the rule of law and where we have energy security. It's amazing. There's a war going on in Europe, and the Europeans are not winning it right now.
John, what I see, if we continue down this road, everybody, or the narrative's been man-made climate change, but I think what we're going to see is man-made tragedy. And that's why it's so important. This film that Walt brought forth is just a great conversation so that people start to understand. But I think it's going to be man-made tragedy.
Well, think about this. So Peter Zeihan, I'm sure you've read his books or heard of him, the infamous demographer, said that by 2050, 52% of the live births will be occurring in sub-Saharan Africa because of this demographic thing where we're not replacing ourselves anymore. So 52% of live births are going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa. Guess who is at most risk for not getting the fertilizer they need to get the yield they need to feed their folks? That part of the world. And so it's abhorrent what's going on. And the impact on the humanity of those African countries is stunning. You'll see, though, if you look up South Africa right now, South Africa has decided that they are not going to turn off their coal plants by the wishes of the World Bank and all of the different NGOs. They want them to shut down their coal plants because they simply can't quite afford it. You know, these NGOs are pursuing the most anti-human policies. They're endangering the energy sectors of these developing countries in Africa, and you're not going to see the economies develop where the birth rate will be the strongest on the planet. It's astonishing, Kim, but there's just this inevitable, again, train wreck that's going to occur, and maybe people will start to wake up. I hope.
Well, it's the thing about this conversation is it really ought to be about science. It ought to be about realism. It could be about economics, which is a social and political science, really more than anything. But it isn't about any of those things. It's nakedly about politics.
Pure and simple.
This idea that billions of people are going to die, that's a feature. It's not a bug. That is the end goal of many of the people involved in this sort of guyism seems crazy to anyone who has children and loves them, to contemplate that a future that's of noble savages. I'm
Right.
trying to imagine the basis of competition in that environment, and it doesn't look good.
No, it's frightening. And I think, what's an inconvenience to us in terms of a high utility bill is whether or not that family in Africa lives or dies because they have food available. And it's just going to be lost on so many people. My very big concern is that they'll blame the lack of food on climate change and not the reality that we're just not producing the kind of fertilizer to get the kind of yields that we're capable of. So again, Walter, I think, Dave, what you all are doing is hypercritical to get the word out, to get this kind of information out to people so they understand what's at risk here.
Well, with this podcast today, you've helped enormously in this effort. We should take a moment now, Cam, maybe you want to step in here as well, that encourage people to visit our website, www.aclimateconversation.com, where you'll find a fascinating film, a wonderful, beautiful human film. We have seen change hearts and minds in a profound way. Cannot encourage you, dear listener, if you have not seen this film, visit our website and take a look. See if you can't be part of a conversation that's really based in human flourishing and pointing decision making toward, at a minimum, a cost benefit analysis. And you start with dollars if you want in terms of cost benefit analysis. I think you might be profoundly affected. But when you look at the externalities to the human condition and human flourishing, it can take on a much more profound view. And you can see our publications, our podcast library, which has grown and includes some remarkably interesting and thoughtful educational, content that you can use that will benefit you as you go about your daily life and begin to step up and become part of this conversation for change, grounded in humanity and realism, and putting that science horse back out in front of that political cart where it should be and should have always been and belongs. You've been a wonderful guest for us today. I've learned hugely, and everyone who watches this is going to be smarter because they did. Walt, you've created a wonderful environment here for, I don't want to say push back or any kind of combative thing. It's just sort of like take back the humanity and put it back into its context. That'd be good for everybody.
Thank you all for all your input. I wanted to inject one thing. I understand if we did away with fertilizer, the people that are left on the planet would be surviving on greens and bugs. So,
can I get fries with that, Walt?
I can't imagine ordering a bug medium well or well.
Yeah. And Walt, really, what you have created, this vision, this conversation is so rich, and really appreciate you and Ramey's commitment to this. So thank you.
Thanks to all of you for helping with it.
Thank you so much for letting me participate.
Yeah. And John, thank you. This is so important, and we really appreciate you as a guest, and thank you. My pleasure. Really, I'm flattered to be involved with you all. So thank you. And Dave, what a spokesman. It's so great that we're all working together on this. And so thank you for all that you do.
My pleasure as always, as you know.
Be sure and check out A Climate Conversation at aclimateconversation.com.